Which historical tragedy were you weirdly obsessed with as a child? Tangential, but I remember a girl in our history class blurting out I love the Holocaust as we went over the 6th grade curriculum for the year. Everyone stared at her and she quickly caught herself. Learning about the Holocaust. Spot the girl with a mysterious grandfather in Argentina. The plague. Any plague really. They were quite common. But in this case the Black Death. It gave me a reverence and interest for disease in general, and it showed how powerless humans are against something so minuscule and seemingly invisible. No one knew how to protect themselves or how diseases spread, so they came up with all sorts of theories and cures. If you were a normal person back then in a highly religious Europe, you would think the end times were surely near. The atmosphere among the general population must have been really bleak. Also, those plague doctor uniforms just look really cool. The disappearance of the lost Roanoke colony. Not necessarily what you'd think of with tragedy, but the mystery intrigued me as a kid. They just went to lunch. They'll be back in a minute. World War I and World War II. I grew up on old war movies, mostly black and white, in the 90s due to my grandfather's love of them. Most girls in that time were playing with My Little Ponies, but I was out reenacting the Normandy landings with my brother's army men. I grew up loving history and thusly it became my college major. World War II was mine too. I was like obsessed by the time I was 7. Like Operation Barbarians, Monte Cassino, all of it just enthralled me. Still remains a serious interest to this day. The Mary Celeste story always creeped me out. It was an American merchant ship in 1861 that went missing. That was pretty common in those times, so it wasn't a big deal, but later, IDK the time frame, it was found adrift with all the crew missing. But there was not even a hint of any disturbances, and food was actually found on the table ready to be served. So it looked as if the crew just all vanished one day mid-sailing. There was also no valuables took, so it was clear that nobody invaded it. IDK just always found it weird. Chernobyl. It's a weird one, but I encountered a video by chance on YouTube that was about Chernobyl, and it just resonated with me for some weird reason. Anyways, my fascination with it never ended, and I went for the first time in 2019 to the exclusion zone, something I'll never forget. Plus as a teen I got my hands on Modern Warfare and loved the level that took place in Pripyat, so I started reading about Chernobyl and was pumped when they announced the new safe containment construction had begun in 2010, which finally wrapped up in 2019. It's not a specific event, but I was flat obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle as an elementary school kid. I read more than 50 books on it. I was scared to death of it. I was convinced that all airplanes and boats were in serious danger if they went through it. I assumed they all actively went around it every day. I couldn't figure out why it was happening, but it must be serious. As someone who lives in Florida and travels by both plane and boat through it, pre-COVID, a few times a year, this life is not one I expected. It was way more important to preteen me than it really is, which is not at all. Same. There was a TV show called The Fantastic Journey I watched as a kid which got me started. Then Close Encounters of the Third Kind kept my interest. The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, solved by Larry Kuesch, is a fantastic book on the subject. The Salem Witch Trials. My mom told me I was a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, one of the most prominent victims, so I wanted to learn more. I must have read at least 20 different books about it and now I've forgotten most of it. I had a work friend who was descended from one of the accusers. She turned out to be a backstabbing bee. The polio epidemic of the 1950s. Even though I was raised in a family of medical professionals, it was my first grade teacher who taught me about polio and how it caused children to become paralyzed. Scariest real thing I had ever heard of. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist now. Thanks, Mrs. Earhart. My mother was in elementary school when the vaccine came out. She told me about lining up around the block to get it, on a sugar cube. Burning of Library of Alexandria and burning of House of Wisdom in Baghdad. I always wonder to this day what was writing in those books. I was looking for this Library of Alexandria for me too. I just couldn't help but wonder what kind of information those books held. The US Civil War. My great aunt gave me a copy of a book called The Yankee Saddle by Vernon Howard to read when I was a kid. She's been given it by her Sunday school teacher when she was young. It's a Christian youth book. I think she wanted me to pay more attention to the Christian message in the book, but instead I read it and was pretty much instantly obsessed with all things Civil War, movies, books, music, poetry. Then my dad gave me a copy of Battle Cry of Freedom, The Civil War Era by James M. McPherson for my birthday when I turned 12, and I devoured it. When I was 14, we moved to America for a year or so, and Dad and one of his co-workers took me on a Civil War historical battlefield tour, and it was like my Disneyland. Mayo I read Rifles for Watty when I was 15 and also became obsessed with the Civil War. I bought a reproduction Union KP hat at a historical village and wore it constantly. My sister was so ashamed to be seen with me. The Challenger blowing up happened 2 years before I was born, but as a child fascinated by space exploration it really weirded me out when I learned about it. My 7-year-old is obsessed with Titanic. Would bring me all of these drawings home from school of dead bodies floating in the water. Then she learned about Jesus. Cue the drawings of dead bodies floating in the water and Jesus floating above in the sky lol. That last statement just made my day. I'm sorry, but the dead bodies floating in the water whilst Jesus just floats in the SK is just one heck of a scenario. Tornadoes in general. We had a big one here in '87 and I was about 11-12. It began my obsession with storm watching and learning all I could about weather patterns. I started getting hooked on nature documentaries and learning I could all about Tornado Alley. Still a fascinating today. 9/11 happened a month after I turned 5, and pre-teen me was fascinated with it because my parents basically carried on with their lives when it happened, and I never knew it occurred till I was halfway through elementary school. Same. I was obsessed with everything about it. I watched recorded so many documentaries, to the point that I was able to point out an inaccuracy in one of them, bought so many books, and watched so many videos of the crashes and collapses. Waco. Probably because the tabloids were so on point at the time. I was 9 and all you heard about was how Koreas was this Christ-like figure and then all the followers burnt up during the raid. The fate of Native Americans. I had to consciously stop my obsession at some point cause it was making me way too sad. I still can't think about that piece of history without feeling way too personal about it. Somehow, I'm not even from the US. I don't know why this gets to me so much. Same here, but I'm from the US. I read a lot of books about Native Americans when I was a kid, many about the Trail of Tears. Honestly, I think the movie Pocahontas sparked a lot of my interest and subsequent research. Pompeii MT, Vesuvius. My class was doing a project that involved cutting pictures out of magazines, and one of them was a National Geographic with a half-buried skeleton on the cover. My morbid curiosity was born early. I stole the magazine because I just had to know more. I remember exactly that National Geographic cover. If I recall correctly, the skeleton was also wearing a couple of rings. I got my copy at a used bookstore for $0.25. I used to pop in there when I was in junior high school to scavenge issues with archaeology articles. When they taught us about where Ring Around the Rosie came from, I was small for my age. So at every turn I teach it to the neighborhood kids and younger grade school kids the song and to sing it with a longer tone. It was amazing once when the 4th grade was mixed with the 3rd graders and I got them to sing it slowly and the faces the adults made was priceless. Playground rhymes sung slowly by children is the thing of nightmares. Eva Peron. I was obsessed with the soundtrack my mom used to play in the car. I legit would reenact the Don't Cry For Me Argentina on my bunk bed. I didn't understand all the political things I was singing. I wanted to name my daughter Eva. I thought it was crazy her body was missing for years. The show returned to Nyers a few years ago and finally got to see it. Not really a specific tragedy or event, but mummies, anything to do with preserved bodies and even anything to do with death. Cemeteries, beliefs, funeral practices, historical deaths, etc. The Tuskegee experiments. Purposely giving black men syphilis just to watch what happens, and lying to them about the treatment they were receiving. Which is to say none at all. I grew up in a lily white town. I am white and this was shocking to me. Despicable really. I wasn't a child but I was about 15. Is this a normal thing? Fixating on a certain historical event? I thought I was just strange when I fixated on Columbine. I was 4 when it happened and by the time I was in middle school, those things still seemed so rare. In high school my big obsession was Columbine too. The Lake Nyers disaster. Without warning, and for reasons not exactly known, a lake in Cameroon basically exploded with CO2 in the middle of the night in 1985. It killed almost 2,000 people by asphyxiating them in their sleep, not to mention the incredible amount of livestock and animal life that also died. Essentially, a cloud of carbon dioxide, and possibly some other gases, spewed out of the lake and kept close to the ground, and just wiped a few villages. It blew my mind that a lake could hold gas like that, and then also release it. I first read about it in National Geographic, and I must have read that article 100 times. I've watched many a documentary on it. It still somewhat fascinates me in a morbid sort of way. It's a very unique kind of natural disaster, and not many of its kind have been witnessed. Probably a mythical tragedy, but I was obsessed with Atlantis. Every single report involved it in some way and I told everyone I was going to grow up to be an explorer and find it. I blame that obsession, along with Indiana Jones, for getting me to pursue a degree in archaeology. I get it. Indiana Jones was a huge part of me wanting to pursue a career in archaeology, but then I got old enough to realize I would spend more time chasing grant funding than ancient artifacts and decided to go into spatial analysis cartography instead. The Holocaust. My dad told me to use my phone for something useful. I was 9 but I now know everything about the Holocaust there is to know. Don't tell you know the Pilecki report by heart. No should do that to themselves. Serial killers. I would read books about them all the time. I stopped reading true crime when I got to a man who escaped from jail on an island, was presumed dead, but ended up somewhere in the Caribbean and raped and killed another 80 little girls before he was finally caught. Not so much obsessed as deathly afraid of Amelia Earhart. I read a book about her disappearance and for the next year all I could think about was how she was going to show up in my room. Haha, of all people, Amelia Earhart. Chilean 1973 coup. I grew up during a time the country was barely returning to democracy among feelings of fear and hope, besides even having a forcibly disappeared relative I never got to know because of it. Armenian Genocide. I actually teach US history and even though it's not on the curriculum I still section a day out for it every year. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis. Freaking crazy, terrible, lucky, almost major alerting of history had it occurred a few days earlier. I'll never wear a life jacket again. Anyway, we delivered the bomb. Kint. Not me but my little brother was obsessed with the Columbine High School massacre, never in a way that made us think he would try to reenact it or commit any crimes, but it was weird. He knew everything that was public information regarding the incident. I think the people who get really into stuff like that is the result of trying to understand the why and logic the perpetrators used when in reality you can't really understand, and that just makes you want to dive deeper into the rabbit hole. My grandpa had this book about disasters that was frightening to me. They were all terrible stories, but the one that got me was some concrete structure that collapsed trapping folks. There were survivors, but what they had to go through before they were rescued has created my phobia of tight spaces. Like most, I was very interested in the Titanic, but also famous shipwrecks in general. Pompeii for a little while too. The HBO series got me back into Chernobyl. Lately though I've been into airline crashes, most notably the 1977 Tenerife Disaster. Tenerife is insane to me because of just how many factors had to go wrong in the exact way they did for the disaster to occur, and if you removed any single one of them, it probably wouldn't have happened at all. Frank Slide, mainly because it's close and even when I was young, when you drive through the pass there is a certain feeling that's ominous. The sheer size of the boulders on the sides of the highway never ceased to amaze me. Was just through there yesterday and I still stare. I also get very pissy when there are people climbing on the rocks. It's like they have no regard for final resting places. I think it was the Joy Luck Club book I read in 7th grade, where the author's mother was recounting her experience with China's Cultural Revolution. It just seemed so surreal and impossible that it actually happened. The idea that a regular society could just be taken over and destroyed by a raging mob of dogmatic idiots was terrifying. It seemed impossible. Like, how could the sane just be overridden? Cut to today. Trump, the mask bulls, denying people's rights in Jesus' name. Didn't think I'd see it illustrated in my lifetime and in the US. Not one particular history but a general theme. How various kings, queens, emperors were deposed prior to the country becoming a republic etc. Russia and France had some really depressing history for their last kings. To be fair, life for most people under those kings was also pretty depressing. My 5-year-old is obsessed with Titanic. He knows all the facts about it, and about its sisters Britannic and Olympic. He spends hours watching YouTube videos about it. It's very fun. The Holocaust. Anne Frank, Elie Wiesel. I was both heartbroken and fascinated over the gravity of this tragedy. I watched countless documentaries on all the different concentration camps aside from Auschwitz, which is most heard of. It really made me wonder what the actual frick was wrong with these Nazis. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I don't know which came first, but I was also weirdly interested in that era of New York history. The Challenger explosion. Still kind of obsessed with it, to be honest. It happened when I was in school, so the teachers rolled one of those TVs in on cart, and we're watching it and then boom. Then they turned off the TV. Europeans systematically burning all Native American science, history, and religious texts, then going around each city rounding up the scholars and burning them alive. Well, perfect question. Well, not were, because I'm 10, but the murder of JFK, and I guess this is sort of a historical one, Tupac. There was a series of popular children's books in my country that dealt with childhood friendships during historical time of war. It was mostly World War II, but my favorite one was one that dealt with the military dictatorship in my country, from 1967 to 1974. They tortured, exiled and killed a lot of people. The book had a graphic description of the protagonist's godfather that was imprisoned and tortured for his liberal views. It kinda scarred me and made me know a lot more. I was 10 or so. Salem witch trials. Weirdly enough, since I was sort of a religious kid, I'm pretty sure studying that and the other witch panic stuff is what made me not so religious. Egypt. Was so into everything to do with it, even though most of it was about the gods, and then World War II, specifically the internment camps, and how humans could do such horrible things to others, but that's most of human hist. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.